Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with J. Randy Taraborrelli, the author of JFK, Public, Private, Secret. He's written more than 20 books on people like Elizabeth Taylor, Michael Jackson, but his specialty is the Kennedys. He's written a half dozen books on their whole clan. We've had him on our show once before, you might remember, in 2023 on episode 136. Here we are in the 180s, hard to believe. We talked about his book, Jackie, Public, Private, Secret, on that episode. Today, it's her hubby's turn. Thanks so much for being here again.
Oh, it's great to be back. Thanks for
Before,
having me.
it's awesome. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. It would be hard to think of someone who lived their life more in public than John F. Kennedy. Born to a prominent political family with big dreams for him, he was watched as a young man, a young sailor, a rising political star, and finally as the president for a new generation for Americans, of Americans. But as Randy points out, we all have public, private, and secret lives. And that is very much true for JFK. Publicly, he was a president. Privately, he was a womanizer. Secretly, he was a fill in the blank for us, Jay Randy.
Secretly, he was a man who was on a mission to try to improve himself, and and that's kind of what this book is really about. It's about that sort of secret journey that I'm not even quite sure he knew he was on until more toward the end of his life when he realized and began to take accountability for his actions. So I think that it's a good question. And it's not been asked of me yet about this book. What is the secret life? And I really think that that's what it is.
Did you find that throughout his life he left clues behind that he was unsatisfied with who he was and then what he hoped to become?
Well, Evan, I think that that's what's so interesting about JFK. I think that if you are a person without a conscience, um, I think it's easier to live an unconscionable life, because you really are not connected to your misdeeds. You're just being that guy, right? But if you have a conscience like JFK did, you're always conscious of the fact that you could be better and that you're hurting people along the way. You just don't know what to do about it. And throughout his life, JFK was telling people, I feel stuck in myself. I feel as if, I could be a better man and I don't know how to do that. He didn't have the tools available to him. He wasn't raised to have empathy and to have a conscience. But there was just something about him deep down inside that made him realize that. And in many ways, that was a torturous kind of existence, because it would have been a lot easier, as I just said, if he just had no clue. He would have just gone through his life without a clue.
Before we
So I,
go,
I think that I think that that is uh, what was his cross to bear. And when he met Jackie is when this began to change.
I do want to go. I do want to ask more questions about that. But before we do, I just want to let everybody know that we have just launched axelbankhistory.com, which is exciting. The site went live, and it was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. Check her work out. It's incredible. The website is up there, and it's an exciting center of gravity for this show. Anyway, why do you think it's more useful to write about and study secrets as opposed to just studying someone's impact on politics or politics' impact on them?
Well, I think in this book I did both, and that was a real challenge for me to try to find the balance between his personal life and his political life. And what I try to do with this book is show the many ways his personal life impacted his political life. And as you get to the points in his life when he's president, you really see the sort of correlation between what was going on privately and how it was affecting him politically and his decision making. I think that my job as a biographer is to invade somebody's privacy. I mean, that's kind of the job, right? Jackie Onassis was my first editor way back, in the Stone Age when I was a kid and I just started writing books. And she told me something at that time, and I've written about it several times in several of my books. She told me, what is the point of biography if it doesn't tell a person's secrets? And this coming from one of the most secretive women in the world, right? But she was able to sort of find a balance between, her iconic life and her job as an editor, as a editor of books. And as an editor of books, she realized that a book has to have a sort of an intimacy about it in order for it to be compelling and in order for it to give new information, because the way a person is publicly is what we know. It's public. And to sort of engage a reader in a biography, I think you have to go deeper than the public persona, and that's what I tried to do with this book.
One thing that's so awesome about this book and your writing is just the outstanding detail that you're able to pull together. It's really remarkable. You recreate in this book very, very private scenes around the dinner table, walking through hallways, in someone's bedroom late at night. It's really remarkable. You have this scene in the prologue. I think it's the prologue or maybe chapter one, but it's early in the book, and it's JFK and his mom looking out over the water in the dark with flashlights. And there are very few intimate moments between them that I mean, I've read dozens of books on JFK. It's so rare that you find them sharing a moment together that's not sort of draped in this stress that they seem to have with one another. They're looking out over the water in the dark with flashlights. They're at a small little house that Rose has. And you even get Jackie's thoughts into this scene and the feel of the wind against their faces. How did you do that? How did you recreate these scenes?
Well, that particular scene is so interesting because that is, the only way I can recreate these scenes, well, there's two ways. First of all, if there's an oral history available in which a person has recounted and remembered this particular scene, then I will use that. But in this particular case, that entire scene was remembered to me by Janet DeRose, who was the woman hired by Joe and Rose Kennedy to live in the household with them as Joe's secretary and also as his lover. Janet was 100 years old when I interviewed her, and that scene with the flashlight is so interesting because I called her and asked. She told me about these flashlights, and I called her and I said, I love that story so much, but what I need to know is what did they do with these flashlights, JFK and Rose, once they got to the end of the beach when they took their walk together? What did they do with the flashlights? And she was so annoyed with me because she was like, who the heck cares what they did? And I said, I just really care. Did they keep them on? Did they turn them off? What did they do with these flashlights? And she told me that they kept the flashlights on at their sides, and you saw the little beam of light hitting the sand on the side of each of them. And that's what they did with the flashlights. And what a visual that was for me. And that was the last story. Janet just died in May. And that was the last story that she told me. That story about the flashlights at the edge of the beach with JFK and Rose having this moment together, standing side by side, looking out at the ocean with their flashlights at their side.
And it's so interesting that they would have shared a moment like that, almost talking to each other without talking. Because when they did talk, it didn't go so well. I mean, even young JFK at 6 years old, his mother scolds him for reading a word a certain way in a book. That's wrong. And it really kind of leaves this mark on him that's like, what kind of a mother are you to talk to me that way? And he said this at 6 years old, smart even from a young age. The dad forced himself on his kids' social lives in these ways to kind of try to shape their adulthood. Jackie would later call her husband an iceberg because you could only see so much above the water. What was this family dynamic that you discovered that created this iceberg?
Well, it was such a complicated family, because they're all of them are shades of black and white, I mean, Rose Kennedy tried to be a good mother, but she just didn't have it in her, right? I mean, she she tried, but it just was not who she was. Joe Kennedy was much more a parent to his children than Rose Kennedy was. Joe filled them with ambition and with a sense that they could achieve and do anything that they wanted to do.
And he paid attention to them. I mean, he wrote letters to them.
He wrote letters to, well, Rose was so funny because she would write letters to them as well, but she would write one letter and
Right, a
fill in
form
their
letter, right? Right.
they wrote, she
A
was
form
sending
letter.
out form letters and just would write their name on top, right? But Joe would tailor each letter for whatever the situation was with the child who was receiving the letter. I mean, I think that he was a really incredible parent in many ways. He was a terrible parent in other ways, as you'll read in the book. And I think that that's what makes these people so fascinating is that, often people say to me, well, what was Rose Kennedy like? Well, that's impossible to answer because she was so many different things at so many different times along the way. But I love those moments of JFK and his mom when they're quiet. And there are quite a few in the book when they go off on their own and they don't really need to communicate. They're just there for each other. And I just think that there's just something so special and so unique about a kind of relationship that does better when it's not verbal.
Why do you think it is that authors miss this private aspect of their lives? I mean, I will say I've read dozens of books that are on the Kennedys, I think 18 or 19 of them that are just on JFK, and you've got more private moments in your book than I have in the other ones, maybe combined, maybe not quite combined, but clearly that's the direction of your book. Do you think their lives were so complicated that other authors just throw up their hands and say, "How can I decipher this when I have to try to figure out how he saved the world?"
I think that if you have a mom and a son walking down to the beach and not saying anything to each other, for a lot of people, their opinion of that would be, well, if they didn't say anything to each other, then why am I writing about it? I think a lot of reporters would prefer there to be, language between them so that they could report what happened. I think they think it's more interesting to report something that happened as opposed to something that did not happen, right? And my view is that these quiet moments are what was happening. And these quiet moments tell you everything there is to know about what was going on with these people. So I don't know. I just feel like I look for detail. I drive my sources crazy. I have a team of researchers, and we drive our sources crazy, calling them back, as I did with Janet, to ask her that silly question, what did they do with the flashlights once they got down to the beach? And we do that. We ask our sources for these kinds of details. We call them repeatedly 20, 30 times per book to ask them, what was so and so wearing? And do you have a picture of this event? And do you remember what this person said? And, and it really does drive them crazy because they're trying to remember stories that happened 50, 60 years ago. Like when I interviewed Marilyn Monroe's best friend and her publicist, Pat Newcomb, for this book, JFK, and she never gives interviews, and she talked to me for this book. She said something to me that was so funny. She said, and I quoted her in the book. She says, I have to tell you, I do not sit around trying to remember what my friends were doing 60 years ago.
but they have to for you.
They have to for me. And then when she said that, it really made me laugh because who
Right.
would be sitting around me? I mean, I can't, I'm not that old. I'm not as old as she is. She's 95, but I don't remember what was going on when I was in first grade, so it does take a lot to get people to go back and remember. I will say though that if your best friend is Marilyn Monroe, there
Write
is
it all
like
down.
it's not
Yeah.
like you're just trying to remember some any old person doing some any old thing,
Right.
right? I mean, this is Marilyn Monroe, so I want to actually what I want to add, Evan, is that my sources are telling me about some of the biggest moments in their lives, right? It's not like me trying to remember my first grade teacher. It is a big difference between trying to remember what JFK told you and what some stranger told you when you were 12, right? So
Right. Is there a question that you find yourself falling back on relying on that you find gets people to open up? Is there something that you ask in a certain way that you found is sort of a magic formula?
no, Evan, I don't think so. I mean, I think that what we do is we let people talk. And and even when they're going on tangents that we know we're not going to use, and this happens all the time. I mean, I can do a 3 hour interview and realize that I'm only going to use 20 minutes of it. I let them talk because those 20 minutes are going to be so great. And so as I said, I have a team of people who also do interviews for me, and it's the same team. We've been together for 30 years, and they know what I want and what I don't want, and they know that if somebody is going down a road and telling me exactly what they had for dinner in 1952, I want that so bad,
Hmm.
right?
How many are on your team?
I have six people working for me, and the lead researcher, her name is Kathy Griffin, and not the comedian. And she's been with me since 1989, and
Wow.
she finds these people. I mean, she found Janet DeRose. Always wanted to know more about Janet, who was hired by Rose and Joe. And I told Kathy for this particular book, I want to find her sons because I knew the Janet could not possibly be alive. So we were going to interview her sons. And Kathy called me back and she said, "You'll never guess. I found the son, but the son says the mom is alive." And I did a quick calculation in my head and I said, "But she can't possibly be. She would be like 100." And Kathy said, "She is. She's 100."
Wow.
Right.
You're
And
exactly right.
she
She's 100.
and she was great, and we did a bunch of Zooms with her, and she was completely, had a terrific memory. And as you read in the book, her stories are unbelievably,
Amazing, spot on. Yeah.
yeah,
You've written about Jackie, as I mentioned. You were on episode 136 of this show. I can't believe we've done like 45 episodes since you were on. Jackie's. You've written about Jackie's family. You've written about the younger generation of Kennedys. You've written about the Kennedy wives. Why did you finally break down and say, "Oh, okay, it's time to tackle the big Kahuna"?
yeah. It's I've done I don't know how many different Jackie books. I did Jackie Janet and Lee, Jackie Ethel and Joan, Jackie Public Private Secret, Jackie After Camelot. I mean, I've been when my last book, it debuted at number 3 on the New York Times list, and it was my most successful book, Jackie Public Private Secret. And I was getting ready to do Elvis Presley. I mean, that was my next contract. I mean, we had already signed a contract for it, and just something told me, you know what, I really feel like I need to tell JFK's side of the story because when you zero in on a person's life, you find so many different aspects of that person. Um, and there are moments when that person's heroic and moments when that person's a villain. And a lot of times in the Jackie book, JFK was a villain. And I just felt like I couldn't let that sit. I couldn't let that stand in that way. I needed to explain him, not necessarily to defend him, but to explain him. And so I put Elvis aside and I went to JFK, and I'm so glad I did because it was 2 years of just an incredible journey for me, and it took a lot out of me, but it gave me back an awful lot.
When you look at the reams, you must have reams and reams of files on the different Kennedys. I'm just curious, how much Kennedy material do you have? And maybe more importantly, how is it organized that you can get access to it when you need it?
Well, I have, and you can see it behind me. Oh, well, you're not visual here, but I have a file cabinet behind me that's got, four drawers full of Kennedy, and then in my other office we have another two. Four-drawer file cabinets. We have so much Kennedy, as you can imagine. And the wonderful thing about the JFK book was that I went back over interviews that I had conducted over the last 30 years with JFK sources, many and most of whom are gone now. And I listened to their tapes, and it was such an incredible thing for me to hear their voices telling me stories about JFK that were not appropriate for my Jackie books because they were about JFK, and for me to be able to go back for this book and listen to these amazing stories and now tell them for the first time was so important in my research. So as well as people like Janet and the different sources that we located in the last 2 years, I went back over 30 years of research with an eye toward now this is about JFK, not Jackie. And that's really the foundation of this book is that research.
You've obviously established a name for yourself with credibility as a writer, but I'm curious when you go to a publisher and say it's time for another JFK book, how hard do you have to sell them on that? This is somebody who's had hundreds, if not thousands, of books written about them. It's like going to a publisher and saying, "Hey, I've got something new about Lincoln or new about George Washington." Do you have to push in this case and say, "Hey, trust me, this is going to be worthwhile"?
Well, you're right. I mean, Evan, I do. Like you would think that. I mean, I've had 19 New York Times bestsellers, and that's a lot. And you would think that I would be at a point where I would be able to say, "Here's what I want to do," and they would say, "Great, go ahead, go for it." But I've got to really pitch it. And I really had to convince my publisher, that I would break new ground. Um, and just because I say I'm going to doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to believe me, and it's a frustration of mine because I think they should believe me.
We all do, right, about ourselves, though.
Right. But I have to prove it, and I am so with every book that I do, it's a lengthy process of a very long proposal. It goes before a committee, it goes before sales, it goes before lots of people before I get the word back that I can do it. And often in my career, I've gotten the word back that the word is no. We
What's
just
the
don't.
percentage? What percentage make it and what percentage gets said no?
Um, I I would say it's 50-50. you know, with I would say that's 50-50. I mean, and then what often happens, Evan, is I start something and then I get this sort of vibe that it's not working for me and we move off it. For instance, I was doing Obama. And I was a year into Obama when Michelle Obama's book, Becoming a Michelle Obama, came out. And I read it and I was like, thank you very much. And now I've got nothing. Right.
Mhm.
I mean, it's like it's such a great book. And there was just like nothing left for J. Randy Taraborrelli.
Was it going to
And
be a public?
that's how we ended up with Jackie.
Was it going to be
Yeah.
a public-private secret theme?
No,
Mhm.
no. It was gonna be Obama, and it was gonna be their marriage, Michelle and Barack's marriage. And when Michelle's book came out, I told my publisher, I think we got to move on because there's nothing left for me. And they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to do Jackie." And they said, I want to do Jackie cradle to grave as opposed to the Jackie books that we'd done in the past, which were in her relationships with other people in her lives." And Public-Private Secret came from Jackie's lover and close friend, Jack Warnicki, the
Mhm.
architect who designed JFK's memorial at Arlington. And when Jackie turned 60 years old, Jack Warnicki told me that he and Jackie had a conversation um, about Aristotle Onassis. Um, in 1968, Jackie left Jack Warnicki for Aristotle Onassis, and he never could understand why. So many, many years later, they had this conversation when he said to her, I just don't understand what it was you saw in Onassis. And Jackie said to him, well, Jack, you know me, I've got three lives, public, private, and secret. And when I heard that when he told me that, I was like, that is the title of the book.
Yeah, you
You
can't beat that. Yeah.
know, you can't beat that.
Yeah. I want to go back to the Kennedys a little bit here. I want to go back to this family dynamic. One of the things that you get as you read about Kennedy in different books is that Joe and Joe Jr., as particularly Joe Jr., so overrated politically, did not have the skills, the deft touch that JFK had. They sort of were living in the past and this idea of sort of American isolationism. I'm curious, what did JFK and RFK have in common, the private and secret parts of their lives that led them to sort of surpass Joe and Joe Jr. with their political instincts and abilities?
It's a really good question, Evan. I mean, Joe Sr. was very conscious of the fact that JFK had no empathy. And I think that, he raised his children to be practical, but not to be to not to be empathetic. And he once told Jackie, Joe Sr. told Jackie, I wished my son pain, which was such an incredible statement to make. Basically, what he was saying was he wanted his son to suffer so that his son would understand suffering and the suffering of others. And of course, JFK really did suffer physically in many, many ways, as I wrote in the book. But Joe was conscious of that, and I think the difference between JFK and RFK and their father was that they both developed empathy along the way, whereas Joe Sr. did not. And I think the fact that Joe Sr. was able to institutionalize his daughter Rosemary and somehow managed to convince the entire family that she no longer existed on the planet, and they never even visited her until Jackie came along. I think that tells you a lot about who he was as a person and as a father. Empathy was not on the list of attributes. And JFK and RFK developed empathy and then they were able to lead with empathy. And that's what changed the game for both of them.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned it a little bit, but I've long thought that JFK's experience in hospitals, meeting the nurses, being around other patients, being around working class people. Most nurses don't get rich doing this. I think that had a really big impact. Then going to war and being with other people who were not of high station. Of course, he was, but most people who wound up in the middle of the Pacific were not necessarily the elite. I think that had a big impact on him as he realized what the world was truly made up of, a world that didn't have servants and expensive schools and big houses.
You're absolutely right. Evan, that's just it. That's it. And I think that, going to war in PT 109 and, seeing the suffering, as I wrote in the book, the men who saw that kind of suffering came back, changed, and 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 sort of their emotions were suppressed. So it's sort of like they called it shell shock back then. And basically what it was PTSD. And I think that it took Jackie to really sort of open up JFK. And it took Jackie finding, as I wrote in the book, finding his sister, Rosemary, and convincing JFK that you need to visit her. You need to confront this secret, and you need to know her. And his whole life changed after he visited his sister. She had been institutionalized for about 20 years, before he went to visit her. And And I
And
think
what
that
year was it?
well, she was institutionalized, I think, in 42.
So we're
And
talking late 50s when he
yeah,
wrote
like,
it.
and he went to visit her in the late 50s. And Jackie found her, and no one knew where she was, and nobody wanted to talk about it, and Jackie Jackie eventually found her. And here's what's really interesting, Evan, is that when she told JFK where Rosemary was, he already knew.
Mhm.
He had figured it out himself. He just had not done anything about it. Like he was too afraid to go to visit his sister. I mean, he knew where she was, but he didn't go to see her until Jackie said, "The time has come. You need to go." And then he did go. And that changed him in profound ways. And as you'll read in the book, that really opened him up.
We've got to talk about Inga Binga too. A
Mhm.
phenomenal nickname. Um, she changes his life. He discovers what love is when he meets Inga Binga. She brought brought good qualities out of him. How do you think that relationship shaped and foreshadowed the private and secret life that Jack and Jackie would have?
Well, I think this. First of all, she's an amazing character, and we interviewed her son, and he was great. And I'm so happy that we have the letters from Inga. It was, JFK was in his early 20s. It was his first love, his first romantic relationship. It ended because she was thought to be a Nazi spy. She was not,
But
but
she
they
did
thought
meet Hitler.
she did meet him, and she had lunch with him, but she wasn't a spy. But I guess it's understandable why people thought that she was, especially Joe, the father, and it was because of Joe sending JFK out of Washington and into the military in the Carolinas that that relationship ended. But I also want to say that they continued to be friends. And he did visit her after PT 109, and she had a hard time getting over him, and he had a hard time getting over her. And I think one of the reasons that they had such a difficult time was because the relationship ended after just 6 months, when they were still sort of in the thick of the passion. And I think that, all relationships sort of have this 6 month period when it's all good before reality sets in. And then before you start to have to deal with people, flaws and all. And they ended when it was all good. And so it was easy for them both to romanticize their time together throughout the rest of their lives. And she had a huge impact on him, as you read in the book, and she's a great character.
He writes an incredible letter to her that you describe after he's rescued from PT 109. Describe that letter for us.
He basically said that, he had learned a lot, and he realized that she was really one of the best things that had ever happened to him, and he missed her so much, and he wanted to see her, but he talked about war, and he talked about how terrible it was, and how much he had seen, and how he would always be affected by everything that he had seen overseas, that he would probably never get over it. And if you read the letter, and it's in the book, you really get a sense of this man growing as a person, and you start to realize that he was becoming, well, he was developing the mindset of a leader. And I think that that's how great leaders sort of evolve, through the trials of their own lives, where they begin to relate to the wide breadth of experiences from terrible to great. And that's what was going on with JFK at that time.
What does it say to you that he never makes an official proposal to Jackie? They sort of have this discussion that people even witness, but he never gets down on one knee. He never presents the ring in the way that I did, and hopefully other people get a chance to do in their lives. Um, it's like a goal that people have this magic moment. He never has that with her. Why didn't that happen? And what does that say about what would pretend, especially for Jackie, over the next 10, 12 years?
Well, JFK told somebody that it really was sort of an arranged marriage. And he said, as arranged marriages go, it's fine, but there was not that spark between them. Um, and when Jackie's mom, Janet, asked Jackie, do you love him? Jackie's response was, I enjoy him.
I wrote that quote down. I don't love him. I enjoy him.
I enjoy him. And that says it all right there. But Jack, they were a product of their environment. Jackie was told by Janet that the secret to happily ever after is money and power. And, JFK was 36 years old, and his father knew he needed to get married because he wanted him to be president. And you're not going to be president unless you have a first lady. And Jackie sort of t ticked off all the boxes. She was beautiful, she was smart, she was cultured,
And Inga and Jackie were both smart, which I thought was interesting.
oh, Inga and Jackie.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were both, you had to be at a certain level to be able to be in JFK's orbit. Um, and Jackie was so incredibly smart, and she did so much for him, and she wrote papers for him, and she was a real cut above. So, I mean, I think that they loved each other, Evan, but to say that they were in love with each other, that didn't happen until later. And as I wrote in the book, before he died, they were planning to renew their wedding vows. And he did in his last year of life present her, with a marriage proposal. And they were planning to renew their wedding vows on their 11th anniversary, and it was going to happen in Hammersmith. And and I gave some details in the book as to what they were intending to do. And so it's very sad, of course, that that didn't happen, but it definitely shows growth. And there's something that happens at the end of the book, and I don't want to give away too much, but I will say this that on their 10th anniversary, they were at Hammersmith, and Jackie's mom and her stepfather were watching the two of them as they were, walking on the beach. And it was clear that they were actually falling in love with each other. And Janet, the mom, turned to the stepfather and she says, my, it's actually happening, isn't it?
Mm.
Like they realized, everybody around them realized that it had finally happened. That they had been through so much in 10 years that they were finally falling in love with each other.
Do you subscribe to the theory that I think Thurston Clark subscribes to and some other authors subscribe to, that the death of Patrick in the hospital after he fights for a couple of days, their very, very young son, do you find that to be a turning point, or is that an overrated moment?
That's not overrated at all. But it's part of the turning point. What I found is that the turning point was happening already. He was, whereas when Jackie had the stillbirth in 1956, I believe it was, of Arabella, and JFK didn't even return from a vacation to be with her. This time, he was at Jackie's side throughout the pregnancy, and
And
he
while he
was,
was president,
while he was president, to the point of actually, as you'll read in the book, um, being distracted by some very important business that was going on in Vietnam at that time, because he was so distracted, worried about Jackie, even before Patrick was born and died. So the death of Patrick Kennedy in 1963, their son, was a turning point, but the turning point had actually begun before that. After Patrick's death is when JFK really realized how terrible he had been in his marriage to Jackie, and that's when he told Joan Kennedy, his sister-in-law, and I quoted it in the book, you know, the way I treated Jackie is very painful. And he said, and by painful, I mean shameful. So he had really he had begun to take accountability for his treatment of Jackie over the years, and and it's and I don't know. I mean, as sad as this is, I think it's a very hopeful story to tell in these sort of fractured times that we're living in right now. of a man who not only began to take accountability in his private life, but also as a president. The thing about JFK is that he was a person who took accountability for his mistakes in leadership. And I wrote about the Bay of Pigs in 1962, and and the disaster of the Bay of Pigs that caused the death of many, more than 1,000 people. And it was a mission that was inherited by JFK from the Eisenhower administration. And JFK had his doubts about it, but he listened to his generals and the people on his team who told him that it was going to work. And of course, as we know now, it did not work. And rather than blame the other guy and blame the other administration and blame Eisenhower, and this is something that Eisenhower totally screwed up, and I'm not going to take responsibility for it. JFK decided to take responsibility for what happened in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. And even Jackie didn't think he should. Like Jackie's opinion of that was, no, you have to, I think that you really need to do an investigation to see who's responsible for this. And Joe Kennedy, the father, said, he's the goddamn president. He does not take responsibility. It was Bobby who convinced JFK, you need to be accountable.
Hmm.
And JFK went before the American people and he took accountability and he said, this is my fault. I'm the president. This is my fault. And guess what, Evan? His popularity, the poll rose to 85%. And you would have thought that people would have blamed the president for what happened, but they admired the fact that he took accountability. And I think that that's what we want to see in a leader. We want to see a leader who takes accountability. And I think that, JFK was becoming that leader.
There are those sloppy political instincts by Daddy Kennedy. We're jumping around a little bit here. That's just, I guess, because I didn't organize this right. But I do need to ask about Marilyn Monroe, a third woman who makes an impact on JFK's life. You learn new things, particularly from her best friend. Um, what did you hope to achieve in continuing to unravel this affair that they had, and to show how these secret moments with Marilyn paved the way for something new between Jack and Jackie?
Well, look, the Maryland JFK romance has been sort of whittled down over the last 30 years by historians such as myself from having been a full-blown affair to one weekend at Bing Crosby's house. And with this book, what I what I did is basically I said, we don't even have proof about this weekend. We now don't even believe, I personally, as an historian, don't even believe that that weekend even happened. I mean, I talked to, as I mentioned, Pat Newcomb, her best friend and her publicist, who told me she doesn't think that happened at all. She said, I would have known if Marilyn spent the weekend with JFK at Bing Crosby's house. And Pat told me, she says, I don't even know where Bing Crosby lived, you know. And then I interviewed some other people and we put together some pieces. And as you read in the book, I laid out enough evidence to support the notion that there's a very good chance that weekend never happened. And if that weekend never happened, there's no evidence of them having been together after that weekend and before Marilyn sang Happy Birthday at Madison Square Garden. And they weren't alone then either. So I don't know when these two people were ever alone together. And of course, they could have slipped off and I would not know about it. But I just think that what happened, as I wrote in the book, is that Marilyn had a lot of emotional problems. And I know about this from having written a book about her, The Secret Life of Marilyn Monroe. And she told many people that she and JFK and Bobby Kennedy were having an affair, but she was imagining it and she was basically fabricating a, a story. She was not the best narrator of her own life. And those people who were credible people then went to people like me with these stories. And you believe them because they were close friends of Marilyn. And of course, they would know what they were talking about. But what we didn't know until now was that she was lying to them. you know. I think that when you read the book, you really begin to doubt very strongly that JFK and Marilyn ever had any kind of relationship, and that, Marilyn was sort of fixated on JFK, and she wanted there to be something, but there really was not anything there.
JFK winds up, and that is certainly new ground, by the way. I don't mean to breeze past it, but we only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure that I get a few more questions in here. When it comes to sort of the culmination of his political career, it's not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then the SALT Treaty that is signed, and that's an important sort of moment in world history that says we're not going to keep on testing and testing and testing these nuclear weapons. In your view, what are the secret moments that formed him, that shaped him to say this is going to be the true test of our time, how we can stop nuclear proliferation?
I think that, it's hard to say, what was going through his head in that particular moment, but I think that JFK had evolved into a person, as I said, who cared deeply about humanity and about all people, not just Democrats. I mean, like Democrats, Republicans, all people of all countries. And he felt, he told Jamie Auchincloss, who was Jackie's half brother, that being a leader was the greatest honor of his life. And he he wanted to he wanted to make change happen. And at that time, it's hard for us to believe it, but when you were a kid back then in those years, they used to have these drills where first graders would hide under their desks as if that was going to protect them from nuclear war, right? I remember it being
Those
the first
desks were
grader.
pretty sturdy, I will say. Um,
It was a huge fear in this country of being annihilated by nuclear war. And that was sort of like the dominant fear in America. And JFK wanted to tackle that by trying to alleviate that and trying to make that no longer be an issue in the lives of Americans.
I want to correct myself, by the way. It was not the SALT Treaty that he signed. It was the Limited Nuclear Test Ban
Right.
Treaty that he signed on
Right.
August 5th, 1963.
Yes.
Just amazing to believe he only had 4 or 5 months left.
Yes.
Um, uh, they transfix us many years later. The Kennedys do. The assassination certainly does for a lot of people. How, particularly in the last few months, where we've seen this talk about conspiracy and these papers being released, how do you reflect on the way the assassination still garners all these conspiracy theories and all this discussion, even though the conspiracy theories are something that JFK specifically warned against in his speeches?
Well, as I wrote in the book, it's sort of the greatest murder mystery of all time because in the lives of a lot of people, it's not been solved. And it was sort of a crucible in our culture in the sense that it was one of the first times that the people began to believe that they could not trust their government to give them the right to give them answers. And it was sort of the beginning of what we now know as the deep state, in the sense that there were people who began to believe that something happened that they were not aware of and that it was being hidden from them. Now, I have to say that I write about JFK's life, but not necessarily his death. And if you read my book, it's a little bit surprising to a lot of people that the assassination gets about, I don't know, one paragraph, you know. And it's because I've never wanted to be one of those guys on TV with the other guys trying to figure out the projection of different bullets, because those guys who do that are really good at it, Evan, and they can tell you every little detail, and I can't. So my biggest interest has always been in what conspiracies did the family members believe? That's what interests me. For instance, Janet, Jackie's mom, as I wrote in the book, believed until the day she died that LBJ had something to do with it, you know. So I'm always curious to know what the family members thought, but I'm not as curious to be able to unpack, the different conspiracy theories at writ large. And there are other guys who do that really, really well, and
But
I'm not one of them.
But JFK specifically warned us, do not go down the conspiracy theory
Yes.
route about a number of things, not about his own assassination, of course, but he clearly said that conspiracy theories are a way to absolve ourselves of responsibility for our own destiny. It's hard for me to see people going knee deep into conspiracy theory, and not just knee deep, forget it, way above the head, 6 feet above the head. It How would he reflect on this sort of mega industry that has been spawned looking into conspiracies of his own assassination?
Well, on one hand, I think he would not approve, but on the other hand, I think he would understand that people want to know what happened, you know, and people really they loved him, and also they loved Jackie. And look, I've been a Kennedy historian for 30 years, so I can speak to this. I've written 6 books about them, maybe 7. I have to really go back and think about it. And people love and admire JFK and Jackie and all the Kennedys. And so I think he would understand that people want to know what happened. And then in that wanting to know, it spawns all kinds of conspiracy theories. And that's kind of just human nature, right? I mean, we can't figure it out. We will start grasping at straws, and lots of people have made, have written books. I mean, how many books have been written about this very thing, about the assassination, you know, um, and documentaries and movies, right? So I think he would get it. I do.
You uh it you go on social media, it's never been harder to keep a secret. What is JFK's lesson for those of us who live in an age where secrets seem to be everywhere?
Well, they were of a time and place, when you actually were able to have secrets, right? Like I often reflect upon the fact that Jackie had a romance that lasted 3 years after JFK died and before she married Onassis with the architect, as I mentioned, Jack Warnke. And they were engaged to be married. And that 3-year relationship went completely under the wire. And believe me, she was the most famous woman in America, and she was engaged to somebody, and the world didn't know it. How's that possible? Today it would be all over TMZ. I mean, you wouldn't be. There's no way the most famous woman in America would be able to be secretly engaged to be married. And I just think that back then you could have secrets, right? You were able to have a secret life, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do, um, Beyonce public-private
Taylor
secret.
Swift, right, right,
Anyway,
right.
I did a Beyonce book 10 years ago. But today it would be virtually impossible,
Yeah.
because there are no secrets today, really. I think maybe Janet Jackson was married at one point. Remember this story? Maybe 10 years ago, it was revealed that Janet Jackson had been married and nobody knew about it. I think
Not
I think
really.
I think that was like the last the secret
The
of
last
our
unknown.
time.
Uh, your dedication is so beautiful. This book is for anyone searching for and ready for second chances to step into the light of who we really are. We sometimes need to confront the darkness in who we've been. If only we're willing to see it and weep after that dark night, the sun rises. How do you reflect on that? Was that an autobiographical statement for you? Was it about JFK, or is it a general statement for anybody reading?
Yeah, it's a good. I mean, it's about JFK, who was wanting a second chance. As I said, he felt that his treatment of Jackie was shameful, and he was trying to be better. And throughout sort of the last half of the book, he's on a journey to be a better man. But I think what I wanted to do with that little introduction there was to sort of inspire in the reader the opportunity to know that you could have a second chance. That even if it's not another person giving it to you, you can give it to yourself. And that's sort of the message of this book. And as I said before, I think this is a very hopeful story to tell in these times, that despite the tragedy of JFK's life, um, he was working toward being a better person, and also a better leader. And and I think that that is something that we can aspire to. And I think it's a really good lesson. And I'm really so happy I had a chance to write this book and sort of put that message out there.
Do you think you're going to pick up Elvis, pick
No,
up where you left off?
I'm not, because I'm already working on my next book, and it's Kennedy related.
Oh, are you
Yeah.
allowed to give any more hint than that?
No, I can't, but I can tell you it will be out in 2 years, and I'll be back.
Love it. Uh, J. Randy Taraborrelli, the author of JFK Public Private Secret. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Revan. Appreciate it.
Check out the book and his website, which is jrandytaraborrelli.com. He also has a Substack that is so worth subscribing to because, yes, he talks about books and history, but he also talks about life, and how refreshing is that? Axelbankhistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. Definitely check her work out. It's outstanding. I also want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.